October 6th. I used to think about the life I could have had. I'm in my mid-30s now, and aside from my career, I don't have much to show for it. Most of my friends are from work, and Matthew was the only one I didn't have to put on a face around. He was the only one I could have talked to or trusted. He was the one who would have dropped everything for me, no matter what. When he told me he loved me for the first time, I didn't know what to say to him. It had been so difficult for him to admit it, and I could tell he was afraid I'd reject him. I suppose in a sense I did. Our friendship never changed in any overt way, and I didn't try and see anyone else. But there was something between us. He never pressured me. He never made me feel like I had to reciprocate a thing. We both agreed we were free to find other people, but neither of us ever did. In the end, he was left waiting for me, and I was too afraid that he was wasting his affection on me to make a move. What would have happened if things had played out differently? Would I be married by now? Would we have had children together? I'd never really had much of a family before, and I was never sure if I wanted one. Matthew was the closest thing I had, but it wasn't the same. Not really. Would the cancer have still been there, eating him alive? Would I still be losing him? You could spend your entire life dwelling on what-if questions. I always tried not to, but at the end, I couldn't help but wonder. What if things had been different? As soon as the sun disappeared beneath the trees, they came. I had expected them to wait until we were asleep, but we were already deep in the heart of their territory. They didn't need to wait. The hunt was over, and now it was time for the kill. David sat placidly by the fire we'd made. I hadn't bothered setting up my tent, and he'd lost his during his flight from the Striders. I shared what food I had left. There was enough to go around, so we ate like it would be our last meal. No need for meager rations considering what we were staring down. The dehydrated meals I had were hardly luxurious, but they were enough to fill us up. It was a shame that the whiskey was gone. It would have made a nice complement to the meal. I could see movement amongst the trees as we sat around the fire. Just a few of them at first, darting between the trees as they spied on us. They whispered amongst each other, unconcerned that we could hear them. Where would we run? We were cornered. "I smell them," David said before I could comment on them. "How many?" "Enough." He sighed and stood up, staring into the woods. "They'll be coming soon enough, when they're sure they can win." I absent-mindedly reached for my pistol, and David eyed it quickly. "I take it you've just got the clip?" he asked. "Yeah, I figured it would be good in a pinch. Wasn't expecting anything like this, though." "None of us were. I don't think even Candace understood what's out here." "Not really." David sighed, sitting tense by the fire as he awaited his change. I approached him and put a hand on his shoulder. I felt his tension fade ever so slightly. "Whatever happens, I'm glad I got to meet you," I said. David looked up at me, offering a weak smile. "Me too," he said. He stood up, his eyes meeting mine. In the firelight, his sad eyes reminded me a lot of Matthew. Shadows moved through the trees, and the whispers got louder. I could hear distant footsteps thudding against the earth, and I looked back. Figures dressed in deerskins had crept into the clearing. They were unashamed of their presence, and doing nothing to hide themselves now. No need for scare tactics. No, they were here for a fight. David stood up as the first of the creatures entered the clearing, and I stood at his side. I'd fought for my life before. I'd found myself staring down the barrel of a gun before, with men who would have been happy to kill me again on the other side. This felt no different. Above us, I could see the moon, bright and full. I could hear David letting out a low groan as the change took him. The sound was pained and weak. He fell to his knees as his bones began to contort. Up close, the details were horrid to observe. Fur bristled out from his bare skin, and his features contorted into those of a wolf. His mouth opened, allowing jagged canine teeth to force their way out of his gums. His hands grew, distorting into claws, and his clothes tore at the seams. I took a step back out of reflex as the wolf was set loose. David fell onto all fours, seeming more animal than human. His eyes darted over to me, fixating on me for several moments. They were the same shade of green. They were human eyes. He was still in there. The scratchy voices of the creatures grew louder as they murmured amongst themselves. But the sight of David in his new form did not stop their advance. In the firelight, I could start to make out the features of the striders. They stood upright like people, but their skin was pale like the bark of the birch trees. Their long and spindly limbs looked malnourished and feral. Some of them wore deer skins like armor. The horns of the deer rested proudly atop their heads, but none of them hid their faces, gaunt and almost skeletal. They had no noses, just an empty triangular pit. Their eyes were sunken and seemed hollow. They either had no lips or their lips were pulled back in a dreadful sneer. They were so horribly pale, and their skin looked like birch bark. Of course, they had blended in so seamlessly with the trees. They seemed like corpses that had been carved from the trees themselves. The weapons they carried were primitive. Clubs and spears made out of dead wood. Crude, but effective enough for their purposes. Behind their ranks, I spotted something else. Just one singular being, taller than the others. I could see its beady eyes in its sunken sockets and its bared fangs. I could only see its eyes glowing like hot embers and its tall deer-like horns. The being lurked behind the striders as if it were a general surveying its ranks. I saw the striders moving away from it, as if in fear or reverence. As I looked into those burning eyes, I knew what it was that I was looking at. This wasn't just their leader. No, this was something greater than that. This was their god. David let out a fierce snarl before unleashing himself upon the creatures. He threw himself into the forest, tearing at anything that crossed his path. The unfortunate ones did not have the time to flee from him before he tore them to shreds. The others stabbed and struck him with their weapons. David let out a howl of pain before he vanished into the darkness. His assault did not distract the other creatures. I had no idea how many there were lurking in the woods, but there were more than I could count. The old god lurked behind the trees at the edge of the clearing, seemingly unconcerned by David's assault, although it kept clear of him. I could see a few of the creatures shambling from out between the trees, and I raised my pistol, taking aim at the ones I could see. My bullets did enough to kill them, but it seemed that for every one I killed, another took its place. The creatures crept in slower. The few I'd killed meant nothing to them. They had numbers and time. Before I knew it, I'd fired 7 of my 12 shots into the slowly advancing army. But they did not care. They did not slow. I stumbled back a few steps. My clip had gone quickly, leaving me with only 5 more rounds. There were more than just 5 coming for me. There were more than I could handle with just a gun. Sooner or later, they would get me. In the distance, I could hear David fighting them, but I could not see him. The snow was starting to pick up, and I could see our modest fire dying as the wind and cold beat it down. One of the striders rushed for me, letting out a triumphant cry as it did so. I shot it in the head and watched it fall, but its bravery had inspired its comrades. They came all at once, and I fired 2 more shots. At least one of them killed, but both were wasted. 3 bullets left, and no more room for error. I turned and ran, trying to put some distance between myself and the striders. The edge of the clearing was just ahead of me, and the trees welcomed me, just as they always had. Behind me, I could hear the striders pursuing me. The sounds of their battle with David had faded into the distance. Now all I could hear were their dry, scratchy voices as I fled into the night. Ahead of me, I thought I saw movement, and I fired at it. I don't know if I hit anything. A sudden screeching caught me by surprise, and I felt something pulling at my jacket. I was forced to the ground and saw one of the striders standing over me, wooden spear in hand. Its skeletal face was frozen in a grin of victory as it raised the spear to drive it down into my chest. One hand held the back of my coat, keeping me in place. I could hear its kin approaching. There was no escape. Not really. I raised the gun and put a bullet in the strider's head. It fell gracelessly to the ground, but as I attempted to stand, I found its grip on my jacket had not relinquished. More were coming. I could see their eyes burning in the distance, and I did not have the ammunition or ability to handle them. I made a spur-of-the-moment choice, unzipping my jacket and abandoning it as I fled deeper into the woods. The cold bit at me as I ran with the ebb and flow of the landscape. The distant sounds did not seem to be getting any further. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement and skidded to a stop. A looming shape towered over me, and I looked up to see burning eyes in the darkness. I raised my gun, but the shape was faster. A massive hand grabbed my head, and those burning eyes leaned in. Closer and closer. In those eyes, I could see everything. I saw the history of that place, the birth of the forest, the gradual growth of the trees, the death and rebirth of everything inside of it. A landscape distorted as it was reshaped by erosion and time. I saw countless fools striking out into the wilderness in search of a god. I saw the ones who'd turned around defeated, and the ones who'd pressed onwards to the point of insanity. I saw their deaths at the claws of the thing before me. It tore them to shreds as they tried to run. It gutted them alive and strung them up. I could hear their screams of agony as they died, over and over and over again. I caught a glimpse of Candace, backing away from the creature and looking up in horror during her last moments before it ripped her open. I saw myself staring at it through the trees. I saw the forest around me dying at the end of time, and a cold, dark, empty planet void of life. Then, I was falling. I hit the ground with a thud, and could only watch as the creature turned and disappeared into the woods. All around me, I could hear the striders coming at me through the forest. On unsteady feet, I stood up again, ready to run. "Do you think you can outrun them?" From the darkness, a face appeared amongst the trees. Candace grinned at me. Her body sat there strung up between the trees, but she seemed alive. "What? No, you're dead." "Indeed I am. And soon you will be too." The striders were getting closer. I could hear them mere feet behind me. The apparition cackled as I turned and ran. The laughter followed me deeper into the woods, along with the chittering of the striders. Somewhere far away, I could hear their war drums starting up again. I could hear arrows flying through the night, but I could not stop to verify any of it. "Nobody's ever beaten it before," Candace whispered to me. I could see her face amongst the trees as she kept pace with me. "You can't defeat them, and you can't outrun them. Give up. The process is quick. The feeling of having your body opened is bliss." The ground beneath my feet gave out, and I landed face down in the snow. My eyes opened, only for a moment, but when I opened them, I was someplace else. My arms were bound, so were my legs. The striders stood around me as their god approached from the forest. No matter how hard I struggled, I couldn't get free. The bindings were too tight. They bit into my skin and drew blood. Their god towered over me, hidden in the shadows. One massive hand reached out, tipped with claws as long as my arm. Then in one violent slash, white-hot pain erupted throughout my body. I was screaming as I was eviscerated. My bones cracked as I was torn apart, and I remembered seeing a pile on the ground beneath me. Entrails, liver, kidneys, uterus. Oh, God. The trees were pulled. I was opened, but I was not dead. Not yet. My brain was still fully conscious. My heart was still racing as I was left on display with the rest of the corpses. The air was so cold. The pain was so much. It hurt. I was fading. I was crying as I felt their God consume my rapidly beating heart. I pulled myself off the ground, screaming. My clothes were wet with snow, but I was alive. In the distance, I could hear either wind or laughter. Looking up, I saw burning eyes in the trees above me. As soon as I looked at them, they vanished into the darkness. It's fucking with me, I thought. The gun rested uncomfortably in my hand as the wind howled around me. I checked the clip. 2 bullets left. I needed to make them count. The drums roared to life again, and I could see Candace strung up between the trees. I could see Tanner and David on either side of her, and behind them, legions of other victims. Look at us, Karen. So lonely without you. They came looking for their own selfish ends too, and look where it got them. No, this is for Matthew. Is it? You're here to save him now, after the way you've treated him? He was nothing but a quick fix, a shoulder to cry on, a helping hand, a convenient fuck. You don't give a damn about Matthew. It's all about you. The ropes around Candace's wrists snapped and she launched herself towards me, mouth opening inhumanly wide. I aimed my gun at her, but I didn't know if shooting her would even stop her. Instead, I stumbled backwards and turned to try and run. Oh, isn't it funny? Karen storms into the forest and demands to speak to the manager because she can't handle little Matthew's death. Don't worry. You'll see each other soon. The air was filled with the sound of Candace's demonic cackling and the horrible chittering of the striders. I only stopped when I found myself at the edge of the ravine, a shallow pocket in the earth, about 12 feet deep. My eyes darted around frantically, looking for a way around, but there was none. Jump, Candace whispered in my ear, and I felt her cold hands on my back before she shoved me over the edge. As I tumbled down, I felt the gun slip out of my hands, and I landed in a pained heap of frozen limbs. I could see Candace, naked and dead, descending the side of the ravine, a rictus grin on her face. I could see the eyes of the striders behind her, and I crawled helplessly away from her. I spotted the butt of my gun, buried in the snow nearby, and grabbed at it, turning to aim it at the head of the spectre. I'm already dead, Karen, Candace said, and soon you'll be too. As she drew closer, I pulled the trigger. I expected the bullet to hit her, but instead she just disappeared. The eyes behind her lingered, but Candace was gone. She'd never even been there in the first place. Above me, the moonlight shone through the trees into the ravine. In the distance, I could see the slope of a mountain. The striders stood on either side, and I waited for them to come down and finish me off. I still had 1 bullet left, and as I looked at the eyes in the darkness, I thought about putting the gun to my head and pulling the trigger. It would be better than the alternative. One of the striders dropped down into the ravine, chittering at me. Almost on instinct, I aimed the gun at it. It raised its spear and came for me. My finger hesitated on the trigger, but in the end I still pulled it. The strider's head jerked backwards and it hit the ground dead. Its kin chattered loudly amongst themselves in response. I lowered the empty gun, then let it impotently drop from my trembling hands. Then there was silence. Silence, save for the low quaking of the earth. I looked down the ravine, and ahead I could see 2 birch trees side by side, as if they were waiting for me. Between them was my killer. The old god stared at me, and in the pale moonlight, I got my first good look at it as it advanced upon me. It stood at least 10 feet tall, perhaps even taller. Massive claws gleamed in the moonlight. Its skeletal face regarded me almost mockingly as I looked into its burning eyes. I felt a deep fear in my bones. It was almost instinctual. Whatever this was, this god, this demon, every part of me could sense its malignancy. And for that, I hated it. For trying to toy with my mind, I hated it. I stood tall as it approached me. The snow danced around us as I reached into my pocket and took out David's silver dagger. The old god paused, but only for a moment. It looked into my eyes, as if to say, "Really?" before letting out a terrible, inhuman scream. I watched as its horrible mouth opened. As the teeth parted, I saw countless rows of teeth deeper in its gullet, gnashing and opening. I replied with a scream of my own. Reaching deep into my soul, I summoned a primal howl to rival the god in front of me. Then, I charged. Perhaps it was an act of suicide. Perhaps I thought I really could kill it. The old god only met my challenge with bloodthirsty enthusiasm. It rushed me, cackling in that horrible language its subjects favored. Its claws raked at me, but it was too slow. I skidded between its legs and drove the dagger into its inner thigh. The old god snarled and tried to spin around to get at me, but I was faster. I put some distance between us, dagger still clutched in my hands. It bared its fangs at me before coming for me again, but this time I saw a limp. This time, it was slower. A massive claw struck the earth in front of me. I feinted to the side. The old god could not react in time. Its claws had swiped at where I had been. I managed to make it a few feet up the wall of the ravine before I leapt onto the creature's side. I caught a handful of its fur before I pulled myself onto its back. The old god writhed and squirmed beneath me, but I held tight, scaling the fur of its back until I was nearly on top of it. I could see the back of its neck, and without thinking, I plunged my knife deep into it. Another inhuman howl escaped the creature, and it fell forwards a bit. I almost toppled off of it, but I was not done yet. I could feel its hot blood pouring over my cold hands. Again and again, I brought the knife down into the back and side of its neck, tearing it out violently and leaving horrible jagged wounds. In my fervor, I left myself open. The god's massive arms swung out behind it and caught me by surprise. I felt a claw dig deep into my ribs before I was hurled away. I landed amongst the snow and rocks, and my world briefly went white as my skull collided with one particularly large piece of stone. A gash opened up in my forehead, and my ears began to ring. For a moment, I lay still, feeling the pain washing over me. But my racing heart told me I could not stay still for long. Slowly, I managed to look up, towards my enemy. The old god had a hand pressed against the side of its neck. It leaned against the wall of the ravine for support, but I could see the snow stained with blood beneath it. I could hear it wheezing as it struggled to breathe. Our eyes met again, and this time, I saw confusion and fear. I spotted the dagger in the snow beside me. My skull was aglow with pain and adrenaline. I could feel the wound in my side burning. How deep was it? Was it fatal? I didn't know, and in that moment, I didn't care. I seized the dagger and unleashed one final scream of defiance at the old god before I rushed in to claim my prey. The god held its ground, roaring defensively at me, but this seemed less of an act of aggression and more of a weak intimidation tactic. This was the defiant hiss of a cornered animal. I knew better. It recoiled, just enough to ground it. As I came, it swung at me with one heavy claw. It clipped my face and dashed me against the wall of the ravine. That offered it enough of a window to get a proper strike in. Before I could react, its talons pierced my stomach. and the pain overwhelmed me. I saw its mouth open in a triumphant roar. The rocks pressed into my back as the old god leaned in towards me, opening its mouth. I could see those gnashing teeth in its maw as it prepared to go in for the kill. I could imagine the crunch of my own skull before its teeth being the last sound I heard before everything ended. This was not how I wanted to die. Grunting in pain, I thrust the knife into its throat one final time as its head loomed closer. The god recoiled, mouth clamping shut. It screamed in pain and rage as blood trickled out of its mouth. But that scream was cut short as I forced the knife across its neck, ripping open its throat and unleashing a fresh torrent of warm blood. The old god stumbled backwards and collapsed. As it fell, I was dropped to the ground, its claws sliding out of me. I felt every painful inch of them. I sucked in a pained breath as I landed upon the rocks again. My hand instinctively went to my new wounds, and when I looked at it, it was covered in my own blood. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew that the wound was mortal. I knew that this would kill me, but I would not be the first to die. My legs wobbled beneath me as I forced myself to stand up. The knife was held tightly in my hand. The only sensation I could feel was pain, but my only thought was to kill. The old god struggled to rise amongst its dead throes. Blood gushed from its slit throat as it tried to pick itself up, but it had no such luck. It was already dead, just like I was. Slowly, I advanced upon it, the eyes of the old god fixated on me, as if it did not understand how I could still stand, how I could still live with the injuries it had inflicted upon me. But in defiance of a god, I continued my advance in anticipation of the final blow. It tried to pull itself away from me, but its arms were too weak. I climbed on top of that horrible creature, and I raised my knife. All it could do was watch helplessly as I drove the dagger into its fucking heart. The old god let out a strangled sigh. Its body seized one last time as I twisted the dagger I'd buried so deep into its racing heart. The dagger snapped under the pressure, but the job was done. The old god's body twitched in spasms of death. Its eyes were wild and delirious. It stared up at me, still trying to understand that I had beaten it. I had killed it, and I stared right back at it. I looked down at it, watching it twitch, watching it die. In amongst the trees, hundreds of shining eyes watched me in silence. I looked up at them as I sat atop their dead god. My blood boiled despite the cold, and I felt nothing but primal hatred for every single one of these creatures. "Come on, then!" I screamed. My voice was hoarse. The words were barely mine. But in that moment, I was ready to fight them to the death. I climbed off of the corpse of their deity. My body was weak. I felt as if I was ready to collapse, but somehow I found the strength to outstretch my arms in an open challenge. "Come on, you fucks!" My challenge went unanswered. Slowly, I watched them retreat into the shadows, and just like that, they were gone. There were no more drums, no other sounds but the wind around me. Behind me, I heard a low grunt and turned to see the old god on its hands and knees. Blood seeped from its wounds, and its eyes regarded me placidly. For a moment, I expected it to rise and resume our battle. My legs wobbled beneath me, but it made no moves towards me. Instead, it remained still, watching me intently as my legs finally failed me, and I fell to my knees before it.
"Intrepid little creature. Fascinating."
The voice I heard shook the earth beneath me, but it was not spoken by the god before me. Not verbally, at least. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. You're the god of this place, aren't you? I asked. The entity did not reply. Perhaps its status needed no confirmation. I beat you. I beat your little challenge. I won. So now you owe me a boon, right? I asked. Right?
So says the law.
Then this is what I ask of you. There's a man, someone that I love, and he's going to die. Save him. The god regarded me silently before it spoke again.
No.
No? What do you mean, no? I killed you just now. I fucking killed you. And I'll fucking kill you again. And again until you grant me my fucking boon. Tears were starting to fill my eyes. Tears of rage and tears of sorrow. My vision faded from the edges, but I could have cared less in that moment. All that mattered was saving Matthew. Even if I died, at least he'd be cured. The god chuckled. It was a low, mournful sound.
I have not seen such dedication in so long. You really are a fascinating one.
Just save him. My voice was weak. I had gone from demanding to pleading. Please, I can't keep going without him. I can't. I'm not strong enough. Take me instead if you have to. He'll find someone else. Someone better. The tears were coming freely now. I'd been holding them back for so long, and there, in that ravine, and in front of the old god, I could hold them back no longer.
I'm sorry, warrior. If only I could. But he is beyond even my hope now.
A sick sensation filled my stomach as I realized what that meant. No. He can't be. Bring him back, please, just bring him back.
The veil of death is beyond even me. I cannot grant your boon. I am sorry.
Tears streamed down my cheeks as I looked up at the massive beast before me. The helplessness I felt was something unlike anything I'd ever felt before, and it gnawed at me. I had done so much. I had defeated a god, and it was not enough. The god stared down at me, quiet and solemn as I cried. As I let every inch of misery escape me, it was patient, and it let me grieve. In the distance I heard a howl, and looked up. The old god waited for me. What about David? I asked. He would have asked you to cure him. Can you do that? The god continued to stare for a moment. Then it slowly began to turn away. Where are you going? I asked. What about David? Can you help him? Please, that's my boon. Cure him. The snow began to pick up. The god left a trail of blood in its wake. I watched as the silver dagger fell from its wounds and was lost in the snow. In mere seconds, the conditions had turned from a light flurry into a pure whiteout. I tried to stand, tried to follow in the footsteps of the old god, but the winds were too powerful. After only a few steps, my strength failed me entirely. I hit the rocks again, and my muscles would no longer obey me. I had used up the last of my strength. All I could do was watch through the snow and tears as the old god disappeared into the blizzard. Somewhere in the distance I saw massive shapes against the sky, things I could not clearly make out, but that were far greater than the beast I had just fought. I could see darkness quickly creeping in from the edges of my vision, and I felt so tired. I just wanted to sleep. Damn the cold, damn the pain. I just wanted to drift away. In my fading consciousness, I saw a shape enter the ravine, something massive and hulking. Amongst the flurries, I could make out a familiar pair of green eyes. The shape drew nearer to me. I blinked, and as I did, it got so much closer. I felt a warm claw against my body as I rolled onto my back, and I found myself looking up into a maw filled with massive canine teeth. He's going to eat me, I remember thinking, and for a moment, I was all right with that. Dying was all right with me. Matthew would be there at least, and maybe we could start again. A heavy weight settled over me, warm like a blanket. I could feel arms around me, and I felt weightless as I faded away. I awoke to find a warm body on top of mine. Arms held me tightly, and I could see a tuft of black hair in the morning sunlight. Autumn leaves fell lazily down and landed on us, and while there was a nip in the air, it was not as cold as I had anticipated. Slowly, I sat up. I felt the figure on top of me shift. A quick glance confirmed my suspicions that it was David. He was mostly nude, but that didn't bother me. I had other concerns. I lifted my shirt and pressed my hands against where the old god had stabbed me. I felt my own skin, smooth and unbroken. No sign of any injuries. Looking around, I saw that we were still in the ravine, but the snow was gone. It was as if it had never been there in the first place. I scanned the trees above the ravine suspiciously, looking for anything out of place. As I could tell, nothing moved behind them. I climbed to my feet. My body ached from days of hiking, but I was alive. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. My heart skipped a beat, and I looked over to see something emerge from the trees. But this time it wasn't a creature or a god. Matthew? He looked just as he had when we were kids. A warm, boyish smile, messy brown hair, and that gray hoodie he'd always worn. He raised a hand to wave at me, and I took a step towards him. Karen? I looked back to see David looking up at me. He sounded half asleep still. David, I looked back to where Matthew had been, but all I could see was trees. Nothing behind them. What happened? David asked. Where are we? I remember the change, but I don't know what happened next. Did we win? Yeah, I said softly. Yeah, I think we did. How do you feel? Good, David said. A little hazy, but I'm all right. I nodded, looked back towards the trees. There was nothing there. Nothing watching us. Nothing we could see, at least. I'm glad, I said softly. We should get moving. I think we're done here. David watched as I headed to where I'd seen Matthew in the trees. He watched as I began to climb out of the ravine, and after a moment, he followed. The walk back should have taken days, but as we passed through the trees, I saw an end to the forest up ahead and stepped out into a familiar clearing. 4 cars covered in autumn leaves sat waiting, and I recognized my own nearby. Reaching into my pocket, I found my keys and the car unlocked when I hit the button for them. David slowly approached his own car and paused to look back at me. For a moment, I expected him to say something, but no words came out. Maybe there was nothing left to say. We both left without saying goodbye. Matthew passed quietly in his sleep on October 2nd. He was gone before I'd even made it to the national park. I'm told it was peaceful, just like he'd always wanted. I wasn't there, but I don't think he minded. He wouldn't have wanted me to watch him die. I'm glad I didn't. I'm glad that my final words to him were to tell him I loved him. My only regret is that I never said it sooner. The other night I got an email from an address I didn't recognize. It was short, but to the point. Hey Karen, sorry if this is a little out of the blue, but I wanted to thank you for what you did. If it's alright, I was thinking that maybe we could get together sometime. I understand if you don't want to. I'm still a stranger to you, but if it's alright, I'd like to be more. David. I pondered his email for a few moments. I thought of the way David and I had both driven off without saying goodbye. I regretted that. I regretted a lot of things. Slowly, I typed a reply to his email. I can't say how many revisions I went through until I found a way to say what I wanted to say. But in time, I found a way that suited me. And when I sent that email, I found that I was smiling for the first time in a very long time.